Hi, friends, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're continuing our exploration about the Lubavitcher Rebbe and the philosophy of Chabad. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas. So be sure to check out 1840.org, that's 18forty.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. I am so excited about our guest today. Very often we have guests who they've made the rounds already. People know them and we try to kind of introduce them in a new light. Today's guest is somebody I had never heard of. I assume most of our guests in the wider audience have not heard of because it is a young, emerging scholar that was introduced to me by our dearest friend, former 1840 guest and upcoming 1840 guest, Reb Eli Rubin. And I was reaching out to him to kind of find the different angles of Chabad that I thought were very important to cover. He introduced me to an emerging scholar, a young woman named Chava Green. Now, Chava Green just finished her PhD, and it has a fascinating title. The subject of her PhD is, get ready for it, the Hasidic face of feminism, gender between modernity and mysticism in Chabad, Lubavitch. And as you will hear in our interview, so much of her scholarship, which is really examining the Rebbe's approach to gender, the differences between men and women, what was the vision for both, how are they treated within the movement, etc., etc. But her PhD is extraordinarily personal. It is anthropological. Her advisor is somebody who I know well, Professor Don Seaman of Emory University, where, of course, she completed her PhD. She also had on her dissertation committee another fairly well-known author named Ayala Fader. Ayala Fader, you may know, she was kind of the external reader, if you know how PhD dissertations go. She is the author of Hidden Heretics, which Princeton University Press put out aside about how the internet is disrupting within the Orthodox community, and also her earlier book, which is phenomenal. Why not mention it? It is called Mitzvah Girls. I have read this. I love this book. I've quoted it. Mitzvah Girls, again, this is written by Ayala Fader, who is on Chava Green's dissertation committee. It's called Mitzvah Girls, Bringing Up the Next Generation of Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn. If you are interested in that, you should definitely read this dissertation. But I want to share with you what her dissertation is about before we get into the conversation, because I think you'll better understand why we approach this conversation the way that we did. Every PhD, when it is published, also includes something called an abstract. An abstract is kind of the cliff notes, the big idea. It's basically one long paragraph that explains what is this study about. And in Chava Green's study, The Hasidic Face of Feminism, Gender Between Modernity and Mysticism in Chabad, Lubavitch, her abstract says as follows, and I want to read it to you in its entirety because I think it's important to framing what this conversation is going to cover. She writes, this study presents the lived experience of Chabad Hasidic women who can broadly be defined as shluchos, female emissaries of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who transform the world through his teachings in order to study gender in Chabad. In particular, the study addresses the Chabad notion of womanhood and the influences that serve to construct this definition. As modern subjects, the women in this study have competing and diverse desires. Some want to study the Talmud, to present an intimate TED Talk, or to step back from outreach to bolster their family life. Yet they subsume these desires within their identities as Hasidim. Since the Rebbe's passing in 1994, his teachings are open to multiple interpretations, and I argue this allows for a breadth of gender ideology to coexist within Chabad. Therefore, in order to present the rich theological worldview of this sect, I employ a methodology that combines ethnographic research with a textual analysis of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's teaching about gender. Ethnographic research means, and she'll explain this in a moment, she's actually speaking to living Hasidim. My ethnographic research is based on a year of fieldwork and interviews with 45 Chabad women in the United States, as well as 10 years of being part of the Chabad community as an insider. I weave together personal reflections, ethnography, and analysis of Hasidic texts to create a feminist, theologically informed ethnography. I find that Chabad women are products of the Hasidic theory of gender that emerges from the Rebbe's teachings and of the cultural milieu of the contemporary United States, in which broad changes to women's roles have occurred in the past few decades. I argue that when some Chabad Hasidim claim that the Rebbe is the true feminist, they are invoking the language of feminism to understand the changes taking place within their community for women. I suggest the term Hasidic feminism as a distinct way of conceptualizing how more equality, opportunity, and agency for women is developing from Chabad theology and the contemporary sensibilities, I love that she talks about that, of women themselves. My work shows how contestations, what a great word, about the meaning of gender identity and its sociological repercussions are as much a part of the Jewish mystical tradition as they are part of broader American culture. That is the end of her dissertation. And what you can see throughout this dissertation, which is true, and which is why I read it, because it's true of Chabad more generally, and I frankly think mysticism more generally, and that is the importance of connecting the phenomenology, meaning what does it feel like to grow up in a certain community? What does it feel like to have these experiences, to go through this communal life, to read Torah? That's what phenomenology covers, but connecting phenomenology with ideology and philosophy. Very often, when we grow up in our communities, the phenomenology, what it feels like, and the ideology are not always aligned. They do not always cohere. And what I admire so much about the mysticism of the Rebbe, and something that is kind of repeated throughout, is that the Rebbe was so committed to integrating and ensuring that ideology, philosophy, mysticism, all of the conceptual expressions of Jewish thought were deeply embedded and connected to the phenomenology of what it feels like to grow up within a mystical community, what it feels like to participate with this vision. And that is why I am so excited for this conversation, which in some ways is more personal than philosophical, but as you will see, I think the greatest expression of mysticism is one that can be embodied in a particular phenomenology, a mysticism that can address even those who don't fully grasp mysticism, a mysticism that gives birth to a worldview, to an experience, to a way of proceeding through this world. And that is why I am so excited for our conversation with Chava Green. So I am so excited to introduce Chava Green, who is really an incredible person. She wrote a PhD entitled The Hasidic Face of Feminism, Gender Between Modernity and Mysticism in Chabad, Lubavitch. One of her dissertation advisors was actually an old friend of mine, Professor Don Seaman, the great anthropologist of Emory University. Chava, thank you so much for joining today. So I was really fascinated by your dissertation, not only by the ideas, but really the style of your dissertation. It is very personal in a way. It is interwoven with your own personal stories and includes a lot of personal stories. So maybe that is the appropriate place to begin to really ground and understand how you came to write about specifically the Hasidic face of feminism, gender between modernity and mysticism in Chabad Lubavitch. And it's not an apologetic work. You really go through some of the very real issues and opportunities in the way Chabad approaches kind of the feminist idea. And it's really the opening words of your dissertation, which I love. The first words right out of the gate is the Rebbe is the biggest feminist, which is something we'll obviously explore. But can you begin by telling your story of how did you get to the place where you're writing a PhD on Chabad's approach to feminism? Tell us, where were you brought up? Introduce yourself a little bit to our audience.
Okay, great. Sure. So I grew up in South Jersey, And I come from a very assimilated background. I actually didn't identify as being Jewish for most of my young adulthood. My mother is Jewish and my father's not. And so I was really raised in like a very liberal secular milieu. And I went to my state school. It's a huge campus with all different kinds of like sub communities, I would say. So my freshman year, I just out of curiosity took Religion 101 and Women's Studies 101. And little did I know that was going to be kind of the theme of the rest of my life.
Religion and women's studies really combining.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the Religion 101, unfortunately, was not much about Judaism. It was at 8 a.m. and no one was awake during that class. But the Women's Studies 101, the first class, the professor puts on the board a triangle pointing down. And she says, this is the divine masculine bringing flow into the world. And then on top of it, she overlays a triangle pointing up and says, this is the divine feminine receiving. And it was a Jewish star. And I was blown away. I was like, this is so fascinating. First of all, I became very interested over the course of that semester in women's issues, historically, contemporary, both socially and also philosophically. And I ended up getting my bachelor's in women's studies. And then I also became interested in the spiritual element of being a woman. And as I went through the curriculum, let's say at my university of the women's studies program, I saw... Which is
a secular curriculum. It's not, just to be clear, you were in a state school. It's not like you were in Michlala or some seminary in there. You were in a state school in a women's studies program.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a very, just typical liberal perspective of a university environment. And what ended up happening over those 4 years is that I saw the women's studies department split into two groups. The older traditional feminists of, let's say, the 80s and early 90s, maybe a little bit earlier than that. And then the women who had become professors like in the last 5-10 years. And I saw that the older women had a very spiritual element to their feminism. One of my favorite professors was a nun who had taken a vow of silence for 2 years in a convent. And she spoke to us about like the kind of power of contemplation, of meditation, of tapping into like a divine feminine. And I was obsessed with all of that. And then I took women's studies courses on like Judith Butler, post-structuralism, queer theory. And I was fascinated by it, but I felt like it was just one option of the direction to take feminism in. And it was an option that the majority of the academy had chosen, but I didn't think it was the only option. And I felt that the spiritual aspect of gender and womanhood had really been pressed pause, like on that whole realm as...
Can I jump in? Can I push you a little bit just to explain to our audience? It happens to be, it's so funny because I also find the different, I think they're called waves, like first wave feminism, second wave feminism. Is there third wave feminism? Is that what you would be describing?
Third wave and post waves, but yeah.
Can you just spend a few more seconds explaining? I think I understand. You spend a little bit more time on that. Maybe it's first or second wave feminism, the more spiritual, contemplative, from a secular perspective, more or less, but more philosophical, maybe even more spiritual. How does that latter wave, the one where you mentioned post-structuralism, queer theory, Judith Butler, people hear these words, but they usually hear them on Fox News. They usually don't, they don't actually hear just the basic of what is the idea. You actually were a kind of like gender studies, women's studies is a part of that. So what exactly does that mean, and what exactly is that idea about?
So interestingly, this is kind of woven into the moment where I approach Judaism. So basically, from my understanding, the post-structuralist movement starts coming out of the study of semiotics and linguistics, which is the study of how words become to translate into the experience of reality. How do we understand why the word tree maps onto a physical tree and delineates that and separates it from other objects in its surroundings? And so feminists took up the ideas of certain linguists who separated the symbol from the object, so to speak, and started asking questions about how this relates to gender. So when we say woman, there's like this whole body of scholarship of what is a woman? What is that term? What does it denote? What does it imply? What does it categorize people in the world as or exclude? And so we start getting into this whole realm of the idea that gender is socially constructed, but kind of a little deeper level is that it's socially constructed through the language that we use to describe gendered reality. And so that's why you have now such an emphasis on the language that is being used, especially in like, contemporary political issues that people are fighting over. A lot of it,
like in the culture wars.
Wars right now, a lot of it goes back to the language, because that's kind of one of the foundational aspects of this. And so in my sophomore year of college, I was, going through some personal upheaval in my life. And a lot of it was the normal, young college situation of who am I? What do I do with my life? What social group should I be part of? But then in the middle of that, my grandfather passed away, and was very, very close to, and I knew he was sick, but it came a little bit as a surprise. And I remember getting the call from my dad, like right after my anthropology class. And I was sitting like under a willow tree by this river. And I started as a 20-year-old having like an existential crisis, like thinking like, okay, one day I'm also going to die. And then what was the point of my life? What did I live for? What am I supposed to live for now?
You were asking the big cosmic existential questions, which we usually spend most of our lives distracting ourselves from. And there are brief periods, you sometimes the adolescence, sometimes in your 20s, maybe a midlife crisis. And then, at the very, very end, most people, even when they have those moments, do a good job of quickly finding a good distraction and not letting that question like really alter the decisions that they make in their life. You, it seems, were not able to fully distract yourself from some of those larger cosmic questions. Why are we alive?
There was no going back, basically. Once I realized that was like the fundamental issue that I had really been grappling with for a while, and why I was even attracted to women's studies, because I was looking into critical theory, liberal philosophy as kind of a way to answer some of those questions. And finally, they rose up to the surface, basically, at that point, and I could not move forward. I was like, I must find an answer. And that semester, I've been taking this semiotics course, and it was basically saying there is no reality under language. There is no essential truth. There is no mutable facts. And I basically realized I do not believe that is true. I was like, no, it can't be, because that's not something I could live my life upon. And I need like solid ground to stand on and to know how to make decisions and to know what's true or what's not. And at the same time, I also become very disillusioned with the kind of feminist, liberal, social justice community at my campus.
Why? Why'd you become disillusioned?
I felt like some of the things that people were doing were at odds with their beliefs, first of all. So they would talk about certain things they believe, but then their actions were not reflecting that. And then the other reason is I felt like sometimes the things people would do in terms of like social justice organizing were at odds with other of my core beliefs or my core values. So, for example, I really strongly felt that the objectification of women was a widespread problem that feminism had sought to address and then basically dropped as like a core issue. And then women just started objectifying themselves and wearing like no clothing. And I was horrified by like the campus party culture. I felt that women...
It happens to be, Chava, one of the most fascinating philosophical debates in my mind is the debate between, I think it's second and third wave feminism in the way that they approach women's sexuality, which is it oppressive or is it the greatest source of liberation? Now, obviously, each side took a very far extreme, and we'll talk about, we'll get as we tell your story more, where you found yourself. But it's a real debate, meaning is that type of desire and all of that stuff that is associated now on social media, it's so much more. Is that the ultimate liberation, which is kind of the way the world treats it now? Like it's my body, my choice, which is, I don't even mean to bring in abortion, but that sense of like, I want to put myself out there and that is the ultimate expression is where most people landed in that question. But there was a generation of feminists scholars and thinkers who felt that was the ultimate objectification of women, kind of taking away their their innermost essential parts of themselves.
Yeah, it fascinates me. And I was something that I was really personally struggling with and thinking about a lot in my early 20s. And there's a few ways for me to answer this question. I mean, I think a lot of these issues I was dealing with, like when I was introduced to Judaism, they mapped on to so many aspects of traditional Judaism, Torah Judaism. And I just felt all of a sudden there was like this light bulb of like, I was only hearing one side of the story, right? So you're saying there was this big debate, and I kind of, like you were saying, I saw between different feminist authors, but I felt like, okay, in society, we've ended the debate, and now women's liberation is like, I can do whatever I want. No one can tell me what to do. I felt like that's kind of where we ended up. And I was confused because I thought, I'm 20 years old, and I do not know what the best thing is for me or the best thing is for society. So if the answer is that my liberation, my freedom is I can do whatever I want, maybe I'm going to make the wrong choices.
You're kind of like back to square one.
I'm just going back and back and back thinking, okay, like, but if that's true, then what comes before that? What comes before that? And so I started thinking a lot about like the collective versus the individual, and how so much of feminism became like this worship of the individual, and like, even the breakdown of like collective politics, because if you say like you're working on behalf of women, then Judith Butler, one of her famous, arguments in Gender Trouble is like, how can you define a woman? How can we gather together as women when the term itself is exclusionary? So you have this kind of like debate between the individual and the collective. And I feel like that was one of the underlying issues of this whole thing, which became for me the language of modesty. Like, how does that function as something that is both an individual expression and supportive of a collective view of sexuality being something that is holy and channeled and has its appropriate place in society and its inappropriate places in society. And
it's directed.
Exactly. And in college, I saw a place where sexuality was completely rampant, and I felt that women were getting the short end of the stick, like over and over again.
Let's talk a little bit, you said when you were introduced to Judaism, I was raised in an Orthodox home. I went to yeshiva for, many, many, many years. I've been in more yeshivish places. I've been in more modern Orthodox places. And I'll be honest with you, I do sometimes have a sense, and it is probably my own lack of faith in my own tradition, or the way that our more timeless tradition has been specifically expressed in this moment. There's Judaism, and then there's Orthodox Judaism circa 2024, whatever it is, the moment that we're in. But my own struggle has been, I feel like, I don't know how confident I am that our ideas and the way that we view society could fully address the contemporary mind. It's a big leap from a secular college student in gender studies to where you are now. I mean, I can see you now, our listeners cannot, but you certainly present as wholly Orthodox. So I'm wondering if you could share with me, how did you get introduced to Judaism, and how did you get introduced to the notion that Judaism introduces itself, meaning what we call kiruv or outreach, or like that you realize, oh, I am now a part of some process that is bringing me in. How did you come to have that introduction?
Okay, so that semester my grandfather passed away. I was living in an honors dorm, and by divine providence, it was right next to the Hillel. And I never thought to step in there, but I basically had like a total shift in my social circle, and I started becoming friendly with some of the Jewish students in my dorm.
Was that a conscious choice?
No, not really. There was a few of them that were just outgoing and friendly, and I was like hanging out with them. And they said, you want to come to this barbecue at Hillel? So I actually remember walking up the steps of the Hillel building and thinking, like, are they going to ask me, like, if I know any words in Hebrew? And I was trying to remember, like, the blessing for Hanukkah candles growing up. Like, I was, like, very nervous because I didn't know if I was, like, Jewish enough to, like, go and be involved. Like, I really knew almost zero about Judaism.
For real.
For real.
Could you read? Did you know the Aleph
I didn't know Aleph
Beis?
Beis. I think I probably had heard of Shabbat before, but I remember I was becoming from, I didn't know what Tisha B'Av, I didn't know about Shavuos, I didn't know about Sukkot, I didn't know about, I never, that first
You're
year.
a legitimately fully assimilated Jew.
What do they call it? Like a child that was abducted by wolves or something?
A Tinok Shenishpa.
Yeah, exactly. That was me. So I signed up for the Hillel website, for the listserv, and they sent me an email. Do you want to go to Israel for free? I'm like, of course, that sounds awesome. My parents were horrified. They have wars there. Like, that's all they knew about Israel. And so I went on Birthright. And on Birthright, there was a Kiruv rabbi from a Yeshivish, Litvish Kiruv organization. And he just had a smile on his face for an entire week. And I was like, how are you so happy all the time? He's like, I don't know. I'm a happy person. But I remember thinking, like, I don't interact with many people that kind of just feel very comfortable with themselves. He wasn't putting on a show. He just was like a really authentic person. You know, in a counterweight to that, I met a non-Orthodox Dati Leumi woman. And I remember she was wearing like a beret with like curly hair. And I met her on Shabbos and we were walking together. And she told me she was the coordinator for OU for that year, for that winter program. And she was running 40 different programs and she was touching in base with all of them. And her husband was home with her little kids so she could go away for Shabbos, whatever. And I thought, how does this Orthodox woman have a position where she's like running all of these I like literally thought Orthodox women just stay inside their house and like, I didn't know that they could do anything. And then she started telling me how empowered she was about like different aspects of Judaism. And it was just one of those light bulb moments for me where I was like, I'm searching and searching for answers to these big questions and they have to be through a gendered lens because I'm such a feminist. And her comments about, you know, kind of the empowerment of the Nida period of like a time of space, a time of separation, and then coming back with her husband, and then just kind of built into the marriage is like a level of respect and boundaries. And I'm as we were talking about, I was like debating between like how does modesty and sexuality, all these things fit together. And she was saying, you know, we have answers to that. Like there's something here in Judaism. And then we went to Sfat for a day. And I heard about, you know, Kabbalah, and I had a meditative practice like for a few years already. And I was also fascinated that like Judaism had meditation. So I came back from Birthright and I was like, okay, there's something here about gender. There's something here about meditation and an inner world. And there's also something here about integrity and authenticity. And for me, that was my opening into Judaism. And then so it's very fascinating. You're asking me about kind of how I came to be interfacing with like Jewish outreach, because I'm kind of like the anti-story of this. Like I
like that, and I can tell it. You know, it's so interesting. I don't usually ask my guests to tell their personal story. It's not usually what we do, unless the personal story is like kind of the essence of what they're coming to transmit. But most scholars that I have on, people, and I'm having you on because you wrote a PhD on this subject, I don't usually ask them like this personal story. The reason why specifically you is, number one, you talk about your personal story in your scholarship, but it's not sequential. And like maybe I missed a little holes here and there, but also the whole dissertation for me, reading it as an Orthodox Jew, and again, this is my own insecurities, and I hate to kind of insert, I do it too often, my own reaction and perception, but I think like the entire time I was like almost nervously reading it, like, are you going to become at some point disenchanted with this? Are you going to stumble upon, you know, the ugly truth, not the sublime packaged outreach truth, but like the ugly truth that like some women aren't happy and some women do struggle, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why I found your journey, and it's so sophisticated and it's so nuanced the way that you approach it. It's not goo-goo eyes, it's thoughtful and it's grounded. That's why I thought I can't really talk about your scholarship without understanding you better.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think my scholarship is personal because it is a deeply personal issue for me. And I also think that this is a topic, when people ask me to speak, I often get uncomfortable because I'm terrified of making generalizations. And I think that a lot of issues that come up about gender, about women's roles, they can easily slide into generalizations that so many women will listen to and say, well, that's not true because it doesn't apply to me, or I know someone it doesn't apply to. And so that's why nuance for me in this area in particular is so essential. And I much prefer speaking to people one-on-one. So like my most powerful relationships where when I was, I worked on campus as a Chabad Rebbetzin, like actually before I was married. So I wasn't really the Rebbetzin, but I was like a shlocha, like working on campus. And there's two women that, I'm not going to take credit for their journeys, but through my interactions with them, they kind of just soared. And it's like a whole new aspect of their Yiddishkeit, and one of them made Aliyah. And like, I felt like for me, that was more powerful than, impact, like talking to a class of 100 people, like those one-on-one interactions, because it's so essential in this particular area to go inside and like be honest with yourself, And so you're saying like, do some women struggle or they're not happy? And like, I actually try to bring that out in my dissertation that I myself am constantly living with these questions. So sometimes I have felt like I found a very good answer for me, like Torah's MS. It's true. Like I have issues. I just call my Rav, I call my mentor. That's for me, like those have brought so much clarity and stability to my life. But now I have 3 little kids. I have my PhD, and I'm like, the Rebbe said I should have a big family. I want to have a successful career. Like, let's go back to like the collective versus the individual, like I'm still struggling with these questions. I'm still not sure. And I go back to the Rebbe's talks. And so it's interesting because I don't want to lose track too much of the Judaism part.
I want to
answer that question. I want to answer the question, but I do want to say...
You just got back from Birthright, but yeah, continue.
I just do want to say that when you first started off saying, I love the style of my dissertation, that is so personal. For me also, there's this interplay between the Rebbe's texts and women's experiences. And for me, that's the essential point, is that Yiddishkeit, Judaism has the written word and then the lived experience.
Exactly.
And in there is where you find the nuance a lot of times.
Exactly. Part of our tradition, though it is not canonized in the same way as the written Torah, is the phenomenology of Yiddishkeit itself, the experience, the lived experience of Judaism. One might actually say is the most essential part of Judaism itself, which you get to, and we will get to. But take us back. You just got back from Birthright. You met a Dati Le'umi, lovely woman whose husband was home. You had a more Litvish, typical Kiruv professional. What happens when you get back to campus?
Okay, so maybe you'll guess by now that I'm very thorough and also very, I want to check out all the options. I want to use my kind of scholarly approach and do the research. So I made appointments with a Reconstructionist rabbi, my friend's mother, the Reform rabbi, the Conservative rabbi, the Orthodox rabbi, and the Chabad rabbi.
For real. You came back and you made appointments with each one.
Yes. And I went to them, I said, what is Judaism? I'm interested in learning. What is my first step?
I need to hear, if you remember as best you can remember, what each answer was. That is, I think I want to do that now. I think I'm going to set up meetings. That's so brilliant.
Yeah. Well, I saw you were doing denominology as part of the denomination. So, so because I was a novice, I was like, okay, let's find out. So the Reconstructionist rabbi, I remember thinking, not sure why this is Judaism still. Like, it was community, it was social justice, it was like kind of returning to the tradition, but making it your own. And I was like, okay, that's kind of cool. But like, I didn't know the traditions. I'm like, well, how do I learn the tradition? Like that one for me was like quickly, like, I don't know. It's not clear. Okay. Reform rabbi. He was really nice. We talked a lot about, kind of really general concepts in Judaism, which for me at the time were new. So I was like super interested. And then I was like, what do I do next? And he kind of was talking about like me becoming a Reform rabbi and like going to Reform rabbinical school and stuff. And I was like thinking, well, I'm not interested in being a rabbi. So how else do you get involved with Reform Judaism? And he was like, well, Friday night we like play guitar and we hang out. And I was thinking, okay, like not really enough like Judaism for me. Like I want like Judaism. Okay. So then I go to the conservative rabbi, and she was also nice, but it was kind of similar to Reform. But the conservative community at my college was like very vibrant. And so I was like, okay, that's interesting. Like they seemed very committed. They had a minyan, often. And so my mom for a while was like, you should be the conservative woman rabbi. Like, it's a perfect balance. And I was like, okay, I'm not making any decisions yet. And then I went to the Chabad rabbi. I liked him a lot. He invited me to a class on learning about the life of Maimonides. I was like, okay. But the Chabad community, I went for Shabbos, and it was at my school, it was like a lot of Persian Jews, a lot of non-Orthodox Jews. And I didn't find I didn't really feel comfortable there. I was like, I don't know anything. These people know a lot. Like, I was like, So then I met with Litvish Rebbe, who was running the Maor program. And she said, let's learn a Mishnah together from Pirkei Avos. And then I'm going to start teaching you Aleph Beis. And all of a sudden I was like, duh, like start with Aleph Beis. I don't know anything about Judaism, but I'm an academic. So I knew that I want to read things in the original text. Like, I don't want people telling me what something means. I have to read it myself, but I don't know Hebrew. So when she said, let's learn the Aleph Beis, I was like, okay, you're the one. So she became my Rebbitzin for like the next 3 years of college.
Okay.
And that Maor program was like a lot of people like me, completely assimilated Jews, just interested, want to like kind of have a community. Some people just wanted like a cultural experience to like go to Far Rockaway for Shabbos or something. And
Sure.
So for me, that became like a comfortable social environment. And
I love that you mentioned Far Rockaway. I grew up about, right over a 3-minute walk
okay, cool.
from Far Rockaway. I grew up in Lawrence. I'm sure
Nice.
I even know which homes people stayed at on whatever that Maor Shabbaton
Yeah,
was.
we went to Lawrence one time too. Yeah,
I'm sure you did. And
Yep.
I could probably guess half the homes you stayed
Yeah.
at, but that's really, really
Yeah.
remarkable. But you're with Maor now. That is not a Chabad organization, to be clear.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That is what's known as more the yeshiva, the more yeshiva Litvish non-Hasidic arm of Jewish outreach.
Yeah. So what I liked about them was a very intellectual approach, a very fun approach. Like their outreach was fun. Like they would have rabbis come who, like, I remember we had a Shabbaton and there was a Baal Tshuva guy who was working at Pixar and he became frum. And he came and gave us a talk about Judaism and creativity and business. And I just enjoyed it so much. The Shabbatons, people were warm and the food was great. And I had a lot of questions and I felt like they had like the answer. But over time, I started feeling like it was a little too polished for me. Like, things were kind of set up in a way that like, there's not a lot of questions. Like they present the question and then they give you the answer. And if you have questions in the middle, it's just kind of like fun or exploration or to get you involved. But like, you don't come up with the answer yourself, sort of. And so I graduated college and I went to Eretz Yisrael for seminary. And my Rebbitzin at the time was like, you have to go to this one seminary, very academic. And to her credit, it was not only a yeshivish seminary because she knew that I was like a little on the fence about the kind of hashkafa. I'm also an artist. I'm very creative. I'm a writer.
At this point, are you Shomer Shabbos?
Yes. Oh, so this is actually a very interesting part of my journey. I came back from Birthright and I went abroad for a semester and I came back in the winter of my junior year. And I said, what I'm going to do, I had been pretty fascinated. I've been pretty hooked on Yiddishkeit, like Torah, Judaism. And I said, I'm going to do an experiment for 1 year and I'm going to like be religious for a year. And at the end, we'll see if my life has improved, if I'm happier, if I feel like this is giving me purpose and direction. And if not, it's just an experiment. I don't have to make a commitment. Like I'm just trying it. And so I decided for that year, I would be Shomer Shabbos, I would be Shomer Nagia, and I would start keeping kosher and dressing more modestly. And so by the end of the year, like I forgot that I even made that like rule. Like I was bargain. Like, I was like, okay, like I keep Shabbos now. Like how could I imagine not keeping Shabbos? So that was kind of by the end of my senior year, I had started those things. So looking back, my mindset hadn't really changed completely. I was still very much in like the questioning phase. My Jewish practice was like a light years away from when I started college. Okay. So I came to seminary and I was like, okay, I'm going to be frum, but like my real question was like, what is my community going to be? Like, what is my hashkafa going to be? So I went to this first I went to Sfat for like a fun summer program that was like hiking, community service. Like it was with an organization in Sfat that's like Dati Leumi. And I fell in love with Sfat, like heart and soul. Like I'm like, this is my place. But my Rebbetzin, obviously was not comfortable with me going to Chabad seminary. And so she kind of had redirected me away from like going to the Chabad seminary in Sfat.
Did she explain to you why she was uncomfortable with Chabad?
At that time, no. But the next summer when I was going back to Chabad seminary, yes, she was like very explicit about it. Honestly, it was unusual for me to find someone like her who's like actually a misnagid. Like I rarely encounter that, but she
misnagid is the term for people who opposed Hasidus, but nowadays it's usually directed a little bit more squarely at Chabad rather than, the opposition of other Hasidic movements have blended much more into kind of this typical Orthodox yeshiva cholent that we have, and Chabad kind of maintained something very distinct that isn't as integrated in what one could call the mainstream Orthodox community. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so she would even say, like, you're not going to be mainstream. Like, you're going to be, like, a little bit outside of, like, mainstream Orthodoxy, and so it could limit you and things like that. I mean, I have so much love for this woman. So, like, I really don't want to speak anything negatively about her. And, like, I think that everything was orchestrated by Hashem, and that was what I was supposed to go through.
Do you understand where she's coming from now that you're on the other side?
Honestly, no. I still think it's a total not real, like, concerns. Like, she would tell me, for example, this is a very clear example. Like, she would say, in Chabad, they only eat certain kinds of meat. And so your husband's probably going to say you can't go eat at that other family's house because they're not Chabad. And now in my relationship, it's the opposite. I'm like, we only eat Chabad Shchita. And my husband's like, come on, like, we'll go to he has like a client in Lakewood. He's like, we'll go to their house and we'll just eat whatever they eat. Like, I'm like, I don't know.
Gotcha.
I feel like her concerns were not, and it ties back into my dissertation. They were kind of these generalizations about what Chabad looks like from the outside. But when you're within Chabad, we also have our cholent. Like, there's a million different perspectives and there's so many different opinions about things. And I think a lot of her concerns were unfounded.
Misplaced. Unfounded. Okay.
But
were you shocked by the concerns? Were you like, what? Like,
yes.
I thought Chabad
I was very confused that she was saying that. But it also explained a lot to me because I saw that, like, the Kirov model in the Litvish community is like they have their track. And then the Chabad model is like Chabad on campus to, Mayanot or, a men's yeshiva, and like they have their track. And at the time, I didn't become Chabad until I was religious for like 4 or 5 years. So that whole time period, I was like very skeptical of everybody's truth, of everybody's like, we have the right way. And I tried out a little bit of everything. And I went to actually 6 or 7 different seminaries. And I, dipped my toes in Neve. I went to Bat Ayin. I went to Nishmat for a few weeks. I really went everywhere because I was just like, I'm looking for my MS. Like, okay, I found Torah. I found Yiddishkeit. But now is like the second hurdle of like, well, what's my community? What is the truth?
The applied theory, meaning how do I take this Yiddishkeit and what is going to be the receptacle, the communal receptacle for the lived experience to be housed in?
Yes. So let's go back a little bit to the gender component. So I felt in the yeshivish community, you have a lot of women who are professionals. And I thought that was very interesting. A lot of women with master's degrees, women in business, and they have like mid-sized families. And I felt like, and they're very fashionable. And I was like, this is very cool. I think women have a lot of opportunities. But when it came to Torah study, I felt that there was still a tremendous imbalance, let's say. I remember in college, the Maor had like a Gemara class, a Talmud study class. And the rabbi's like, sorry, it's only for men. And so I went to the Rebbe and I'm like, can I study Talmud with you? And she's like, oh, let's learn Pirkei Avos again. I'm like, because she's like, it's the Mishnah, it's part of the oral law. And I'm like, I know enough by now to know it is not the same thing as the Talmud because halacha is not derived from the Mishnah. You have to learn Shulchan Aruch, you have to learn Talmud. And I was starting to realize as I got deeper in that there was going to be things I was not going to be able to learn in this community. And then I went to Eretz Yisrael and I started meeting more people who were like really Haredi. And I started feeling like their vision of womanhood did not align with mine. Like kind of this pinnacle of like supporting their husbands in Kollel for many years. And I felt it was this like a gentle, like kind of like you're agentive to like the main thing that's going on, and it's like a supporting role. And just me personally, I was like, oh, this just isn't sitting right. And so that was part of some of the things that were going on when I was thinking about leaving Neve and going to a different seminary. And I came to Sfat, and I was just there for like a few months, hanging out. Like I lived in a cave. Like someone had this apartment that they had like dug out of the mountain, and it was just a bed with like a microwave. Like I spent a few months living there, and like I was like, like how do I apply this when I'm like not sure about this whole like, you know, Kiruv environment in the yeshivish community, but they said these things about Chabad, so I'm like a little bit suspicious about Chabad. I don't know. It was a very confusing time for me. So then what happened is I was wandering around Sfat. I was working a little bit. I was like, I really need to like be learning. So I went to a class at the Beis Chabad library. They had like a little library, and it was not a seminary, or it wasn't a cent, which is like more Kiruv like outreach focused, like shlichus. This was just a class of actually older divorced women that had moved to Sfat to kind of restart their life, like older Jewish, and they were Americans. So I went to this class, and it was right for Pesach, and the rabbi was going through each makkah, each plague, and explaining what sphera, what like divine emanation of God it was related to. And he went through all 10 plagues and all 10 sphera. And I was blown away. I was like, I love this. This is so interesting. And I went in after, I was like, how did you figure this out? And he just laughed. He's like, I didn't figure this out. This is in Hasidus, Chabad Hasidus. Yeah. And I was like, okay, I need to learn this more. And so I went to Machan Alta, and that time at Machan Alta for me was a time of really kind of challenging my preconceived notions about Chabad, allowing myself to just learn. And I also asked them a lot of questions about women's roles. And they told me about this sikha that now is one of the sikhas of my dissertation, Parshas Emor, where the Rebbe talks about women learning Gemara, and how in this time period, the reasons why in the original sources women are not allowed to learn the oral Torah is because it will bring them to like licentiousness or cleverness. You know, there's different words in Hebrew that are used from the Gemara and Rambam.
Sure.
But the Rebbe takes that word and he says women in our generation, they must be learning the oral Torah because they need to actually have that cleverness, that idea, in order to challenge the views of the outside world. And also because if they don't receive that deep understanding, that intellectual understanding in Yiddishkeit, they're going to go looking for it outside of Judaism, which is a kind of classic view of this. But I think for me, that was like a very important issue. And to see that the Rebbe spoke differently about it was one of many, many steps on my path towards becoming Chabad.
Now, how were you able to fully step into Chabad when the differences between gender are so strong? Meaning, were you able, people talk about, their separate roles, but at the end of the day, there are a lot of things that women simply don't do. I don't want to say cannot do, because there are communities where they do, but certainly in most Orthodox communities, it is extraordinarily gendered, most notably the participation in shul, in synagogue services. Women are not typically, again, we're talking always in generalizations, but typically in the Orthodox community, women are not leading services. They are not reading from the Torah. Why, for you, given your background, where you're not just an assimilated Jew who will take whatever you're a gender studies major, why is the traditional Jewish community, why is it just not a non-starter, a deal breaker, a red flag? Look around, the misogyny is everywhere. How did you even acclimate yourself to it as a possibility when it doesn't take 5 years to discover that women, let's just be blunt, are not counted for a minyan in the Orthodox community? Why was that not a deal breaker for you?
Okay, great question. So part of my journey, both as a feminist and as becoming religious, was to question everything. So when I read the original Jewish feminist concerns with traditional Judaism, I thought about, well, what is power? What is authority? And what does it mean to be counted? because I thought, one of the things I'm very, very passionate about is that there was a certain moment in feminism that is part of radical feminism. And its viewpoint was the world is created by men for men. And all of the institutions, structures, and theologies and philosophies, all of those things are there with the man as the neutral, and anyone else is the marked category. So if the man is the A, the woman is the A minus.
We're the default.
Yeah, the man is the default. We say mankind. Now it's like polite to say humankind or peoplehood, whatever, but the man throughout history is the default. And so you have this moment in feminism where they said, it doesn't really do anything to have a woman president. Like, nothing will be accomplished. The only thing that will be accomplished is the representation of women. And maybe that woman will bring in more of women's experiences. But the entire system is built for a man. And you have this also in the professional world. Like the office building is built for a man's body, a man's experiences. For women who have children, who have totally different experiences, like the literal building is not built for them. Like, okay, so.
It's just so interesting. There's a comedian named Rory Scovel who has a joke. I wish I remember the exact details, but there's a bumper sticker that he makes fun of where the bumper sticker said, God made man and saw that he wouldn't be so great, so then he made a woman. And Rory makes fun of that bumper sticker, that notion that, it's trying to say that women are more exalted. It's like a feminist bumper sticker, but Rory Scovel points out, then he made a woman, meaning in that very bumper sticker, if you listen closely, you're still ascribing exclusive maleness to the God figure.
Yeah, so you have this throughout history. Like, you have just the man as the authority, the power, the neutral, all these things. And so there's this moment in radical feminism where they're like, let's remake the world. Let's make an entirely new world that is feminine, that is coming out of the female experience. And maybe we're not going to change the world. Maybe we should make our own world. And they made communes and all these things. Okay, so that was a big disaster. But for me, what it really made me think about is, do I want the thing that the man has, and why? Do I want to wrap tefillin, and why? What is the inner desire coming from? And so for me, I felt like a lot of those feminist things were, I want it because the man has it, and the man's a more important person. Society cares more about what men do than what women do. So I want to be in the position the man is in, and now there's a woman in that position. Now I have power. Now I have authority. Now I'm valued. And I felt like it is a total disregard to what it means to be a woman, to value and enjoy and gain authority and power through what it means to be a woman.
Deliberately through your role, meaning through your, I don't even like the word role, but through your unique experience, talents, outlook, rather than superimposing some other vision onto yourself, cultivating and finding kind of your own space and taking ownership of it.
Yeah. So to go back to your original question, that's my answer. Like, I was not interested really what's going on in shul. Like, I didn't want to be doing what men wanted to do in shul. I wanted to understand why Judaism revolves around the home, why Shabbos is so essential, why like Pesach is like all about the food you're eating in your house. Like Pesach davening is not like a huge thing. Pesach is, what is your mother making me eat? Like there's so much about Judaism
that's such an interesting, it's so simple, but it's like, I love when it's like hiding in plain sight. Mm-hmm. That when you close your eyes and think about Pesach, do you think about who laned on Chol Hamoed, or do you think about like the Seder and what you ate and the home experience? And you're basically saying what you found was that you found a very almost more essential area which you do have deep authority over.
Yeah, and it's from God.
And religious authority.
Yeah.
Because I just want you to elaborate and contrast, because you began saying it, but I think it's very important. How does the Chabad approach to feminism and women differ from the rest of the Orthodox community. You highlighted something that I thought was very important, where you said in the Litvish community you do find, and I've noted this, I used to work for Mishpacha magazine, which is getting a great deal of criticism because they don't even show pictures of women generally in the magazine. However, I always would remind people all the decision makers, the major people there, were women, all of them. And they were like business women. They were like in charge. So how is the Chabad vision different than the, other streams within the traditional Orthodox community?
So for me, it all comes back to the Rebbe's guiding teachings. His guiding principle throughout his leadership was that God wants a dira b'tachtenim, a dwelling place in the physical world. And a dira is a home, right? I think in modern Hebrew, it's like an apartment.
Literally.
It's
a dira is like your dorms. They call it like your dira. When you dorm in yeshiva, they call it a dira.
Yeah. So what does God want? God wants you to make him feel at home. He does not want to feel at shul. He wants to feel at home. And so the Rebbe's whole zeitgeist was bring God into the material, physical world, doing mitzvos, inspiring other Jews, building Chabad houses. In your own thoughts, you're in a challenging situation, bring God into that place. Is that
why they're called Chabad houses? I've never even put that together. I wonder.
Yeah,
fascinating. Okay, keep going.
I think it's part of it. So what I argue in my dissertation is that the fact that this is the highest value, the highest goal of the creation of the world, according to the Rebbe, is that it deeply democratizes Judaism, because anybody can make a dir b'tachtenim in any moment, with any situation, and with any knowledge of Judaism. It's completely democratic. So what you have in Chabad, I feel, is that, so sure, you step back a little bit, and the Rebbe divided everybody's roles. Obviously, the woman is the keres habayis, is the foundation of the home, and she's a shlucha, and that looks different than being a Chabad rabbi, and what men are responsible for, and even what children. The Rebbe spoke to children constantly. But what he did is he gave everybody the same marching orders. And like you were saying before, it's religious authority. I mean, the term authority I don't love. I think that
why?
I don't know why authority is so important. I think for me, my love of Hasidus comes from the fact that you're just rejecting everything the world says is important. You just want what Hashem wants, So unless Hasidus is saying you have to have authority because, let's say, you're the head rabbi of a country and you need to step into that position with authority, then that's where Hashem put you. But in my life, do I need authority? No, I need compassion. I need bittul. Sometimes I need to nullify my own desires for my children's desires. So for me I like challenging a lot, what the world says is important. So I go through this in my dissertation and in my research, trying to kind of go back deeper and deeper. What is really important? And if the world says something is so important, and feminists have fought for that, how do Chabad women maybe conceptualize that differently? How does the Rebbe conceptualize that differently? So I see a lot of differences there. And then you go through the Rebbe's sichas, and for me, he creates this constellation of a woman's role. It is not one thing. It is many different pieces, and I feel there is a lot of personal choice in which aspect of being a woman in Chabad you want to dive into and make your thing.
Could you share some of the pieces in that constellation? I love that language, the constellation and choice. But what is the landscape of that constellation?
Okay, so what I did in order to kind of ground this is I picked out, maybe 10 different talks from the Rebbe, and I drew out what his kind of directive was in that particular talk for women. And then I compare and contrast them. So I'll give you 2 examples. So one, he has a sicha about Dinah being abducted by Shechem and the horrible things that happened to her. And he goes to look at the Rashi, and Rashi says, Dinah's called an outgoing woman, just like her mother Leah was. And Rashi brings that point for the pasuk of when she's abducted. And so all the Mefarshim say the reason she's abducted because she went out.
Commentaries. Yeah.
All the commentaries say she went out, a woman's supposed to be home where she's protected, but she went out into the fields. And so she was open to, she was vulnerable. And the Rebbe reads that and he says, there's a general principle that the Torah that only speaks positively, and especially about tzaddikim, like a daughter of Yaakov, of Jacob, so Dinah must be a righteous woman. And he says that we learn from this that when a woman has a particular talent in influencing and inspiring people, she must go out of her home and use that power and use that talent. And by doing that, she'll find Jewish women who are, quote unquote, on the outside of Judaism, meaning they don't find themselves within Judaism, and she will bring Judaism to them because they're not coming to Judaism. She will bring it to them and she will inspire them. And he says, but she does this within the bounds of modesty. But I have a whole discussion about modesty. The Rebbe, when he talks about modesty, he is not talking about clothing. He's not talking necessarily even about, being in public, because obviously he's telling women to go to public. What he's talking about is the modality. The way that you accomplish something must be through a panemius way, an inner way. Not like, and so this ties back into what I was saying about authority and power. So the Chabad Rebbetzin is not necessarily the one, or a Chabad woman does not necessarily need to run around and make a big stir and, be on TV or like kind of try to be super, super public. But she goes out in a way of innerness by speaking to people one-on-one, by speaking to people where they're at, by doing things that, are like beautiful programming and things like that. And so this is one facet of being a Chabad woman, is that we have an imperative to go out into the world and use our talents. Okay. So now I'm going to contrast this to another very famous Sikha in Chabad that the Rebbe spoke about the prophetess Chana. And in the prophets, there's a section where it talks about Chana going up to Shiloh with her husband Elkanah. And they were a very famous couple, and people looked up to them, and they would go to the Mishkan where Hashem's presence was, where God's presence was, and they would have these like super powerful spiritual experiences connecting to God. And one thing that Hannah always prayed for was to have a child. And the Rebbe says when she had her child, when God blessed her with a child, she stayed home for 3 years until he was weaned. She did not go to the Mishkan. She did not go to this place and she knew what she was missing out on because she was a prophetess. So she knew she was going to have like crazy, powerful spiritual experiences, but her son was more important. And so she stayed home for 3 years. And he says, this is a directive to all the Jewish women that their most powerful experience of God is in their home. And that is where they have the most impact on the world, is by raising children and showing the children that they are the most important thing. And through this, they will create generations of Jews who are connected to God. And so this Chana Sikha is raised a lot by women who say, let's say some woman is like, I miss going to shul so much. And a woman will say, but Chana stayed home. Like this Sikha is part of kind of the Chabad lexicon of the importance of being a mother, the importance of staying home, the importance of creating like a certain vibe in your home that's like welcoming and warm. And so I bring this to show that the Rebbe felt very strongly about the value of the home and the value of a woman's role in the home, of creating it to how it feels for everybody there. But he also made it very clear that women are not confined to the home. Like they have a very important public role in Chabad as well.
Meaning they can go out, meaning the reason why you specifically are contrasting these two is because they really are in dialogue with each other, whereby you did not read the Rebbe's Torah and get the impression that the women's role, so to speak, is in the kitchen. That was not like, you didn't, did any of your censors ever go off and say, like, getting that stay in the kitchen vibe?
Okay, so to be honest, sometimes I do feel like the Rebbe was trying to change our mentality that the home is a really important place. And sometimes for me, that kind of does go into like these like older feminist speakers who were like, the home is a traditional prison of women and it prevents them from impacting society and all these things. But I feel like when the Rebbe says that, it's always within a context of this is where your power is. So we're not putting you there. You're not being pushed there. You have the choice to recognize your power in your home. And it's like an ongoing struggle. And I think one of the things the Rebbe was doing when he said this is he recognized this is a struggle for women now. This is not a taken for granted thing that you're super happy to be a stay-at-home mom. Like, we're in the day and age where it is much more exciting and alluring and sometimes personally satisfying to go out into the world and have a career. And I think sometimes, like, why is the Rebbe telling? He's not talking to secular women. Oh, it's so important to go home and raise your kids. He's talking to a bunch of Hasidic women out of Fabringen.
Such an important point.
Like, why does he have to tell all these Hasidic women it's so valuable that you're in your house? Aren't they already doing that?
Yeah.
But the point is,
why is it? Yeah.
It's a contested value. Chabad women are also American citizens. They go shopping in the supermarket. They're on their online, at the time not online, but maybe they're hearing the radio, they're watching TV. Yeah. They want to be super fashionable and with it and, all these things. And at the same time, the Rebbe is saying, don't forget you're a Hasidic woman. And I want you to understand why it's so important that you're going to raise the next generation, even when all of these other things are super alluring. And then the Rebbe says the next step, which is, and I also want you to do all of those things, but with the foundation of the fact that you have to do it l'shem shamayim, like for Hashem,
Purposeful,
not just like for fun, for yourself.
Yeah.
Like he would tell, I have a whole section in my research about shaitels, about wigs, because this was an area where the Rebbe was so passionate that women should have expensive wigs.
So I was going to get to that, and okay. I want to hear this so badly, because the question I was going to ask you is, whenever somebody chooses to be a part of a community, their experience in that community is always going to be anchored and animated by that initial choice. Now, I never had an initial choice, and when you're raised within a community, you don't really have, so usually your second choice might be when you go to yeshiva or seminary, it's later in life. But you had an initial choice. It was very ideological. How did you avoid, or how do you process the contemporary lived experience of Chabad women, where, I'll be honest, their reputation in the Orthodox world, it's like almost a running joke, is that Chabad women are the most beautiful, the most fashionable, the most on Instagram, doing everywhere. And I'm wondering if the way you process that was by saying, okay, every, movement, eventually becomes, a little bit more cultural and has break-offs and needs to reinsert ideology, or were you able to look at the contemporary state and almost see the echoes in some ways of the Rebbe's prioritization of what women should be focused on and feel proud about?
Yeah. So this is a tension that I really explore and I really think about personally and also in my academic work. I'm playing with the idea of calling it a modern sensibility in Chabad, but then I think about
I'm smiling because the intro to 1840 is balancing traditional sensitivities with modern sensibilities.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. I knew I was not the first one to come up with it, but very cool. Exactly. And this is something that, first of all, is a principle throughout Judaism, that Judaism has always evolved and adapted in its contemporary culture that it's within. And that's not I don't think that's a failing or a downside. I think that's one of the ways that Judaism has survived, and one of its kind of this inner power that we have as a Jewish people to maintain our faith and our values within that changing culture by not being stuck in one particular way. Because if you're stuck in 1840 and you're I can't move past it, you're going to die out, So I really think about the ways that Chabad women pull in aspects of contemporary American culture, whether it's fashion, whether it's home decor, mental health is a big one. And you see that across Orthodoxy as a whole, right? But what I see among Chabad women is that there's a lot of internal narratives about how this fits into the Rebbe's Hasidus. So I didn't necessarily feel like I was looking for that or making the connection. Chabad women make that connection themselves.
They're grappling with it.
Yeah, they're really thinking about it, So a woman was saying that she's a shlucha and she grew up with a mother who was the outgoing shlucha, the so to speak, the dina, who was every night making programs, every Shabbos hosting 100 people, every day on campus meeting with professors. And she grew up thinking, I can't be like that. My mother was never around. It was so hard. And so she's a shlucha. And she said for the first few years, that was her shluchas. And she became depressed, clinically depressed, and she felt like her children didn't have her. And she shifted her whole shlichus to being like really focused on her kids. And her whole experience with like self-care, which is a very like self-care, it's a very like social media, Instagram sort of concept, but she filtered it through the Rebbe's teachings. She told me about her experience all through things she had learned from the Rebbe's sichas, from teachers, all these things. So I feel like, for me, like on the inside, it's very clear why Chabad is moving in certain directions. I think that the Rebbe instigated these things. Like he has a sicha about Chaf B'Shvat, the Rebbetzins' birthday, and it's all about making your home beautiful, bringing beauty into Hashem's world, because it's not enough to just make a dira b'tachteinim. The actual dira should be beautiful. In the language of Judaism, it's a hit or mitzvah. Like you beautify the mitzvah, you like spend more money on your esrog or more money on your menorah. But the Rebbe took that and applied it to everything. So you have an entryway.
The living room.
Yeah, your living room. You're going to get curtains. Don't buy $5 curtains. Buy $500 curtains. Like, because those curtains are going to be there when you're sitting at your Shabbos table and you're going to be looking at them. And you should feel like Shabbos is beautiful and there's so much pleasure and enjoyment. And the Rebbe spoke so much about, and also like, just one little side point, because I love Hasidus, but like the highest levels of Hashem's emanations in the world is Keser, is the crown. And within Keser, you have two levels, pleasure and desire. And that is like the point within ourselves where we reach Hashem. When we tap into pleasure in Hashem's world and we follow our inner desires. And so much of the Rebbe's Hasidus is like bringing Mashiach by integrating all of these like high lofty things in Kabbalah and Hasidus into like, okay, you're building your Chabad house and you have this amount of money. And then you realize like, yeah, but we don't need like regular stairs. We need like a beautiful floating staircase that like goes up, you know? And it's not just materiality. It's not gashmias. It's making a dir b'tachteinim.
I just find your story and your outlook to be so deeply inspiring. Like I am awoken right now, but I wanted to ask you, I interrupted you when the Rebbe spoke about expensive shetels. Usually in the Orthodox community, when rabbis talk about shetels, it's usually in the opposite direction. They're usually criticizing and saying it's too long, it's too lace, it's too this, it's too that. I didn't know this. What did the Rebbe say about shetels?
Okay, so there's a lot of more personal commentary.
A shetel, just for our listeners, is the Yiddish term for the wig that traditionally married Orthodox women wear.
Yeah. Okay. So this came up in my field work when I was doing research for my dissertation. Lace shetels had become really, really popular a number of years ago. And I wasn't sure the legal halachic ramifications of lace shetels. I saw everyone was wearing them, but I was like, but you know, what's the deal? They look like really, really natural. Like you sometimes can't tell if a woman's wearing a shetel or not. And so there was a lot of discussion among people in Chabad that the Rebbe, when women were coming to America, when Jewish women, Orthodox women were coming to America after the war, like it was not a common custom to wear a wig.
No, it was
like,
not.
To cover their hair at all, and then for sure
Correct.
not a wig. And so the Rebbe, when people would come to him, he would sometimes ask the man in the private audience, does your wife wear a wig? And he would say, I don't know, or it's too much money or something like that. And many times the Rebbe took from his own money and gave it to the husband and said, go to Manhattan, to Broadway, and find out who makes wigs for the theater and buy the most expensive wig for your wife. And so this was the Rebbe's view. He wanted women to wear wigs. One of the reasons is a very famous letter he wrote to somebody that if you're at a fancy function and the president of the United States walks in and you're wearing a little scarf on your head, you're going to quickly take it off because you won't want to be embarrassed that you're sticking out. If you're wearing a wig, first of all, you're not going to be embarrassed, because it should look beautiful and it should look like your hair. It should look natural. And you also won't be able to just take off a wig in public very easily. And so the Rebbe, I think, wanted to encourage mitzvah observance, that women should cover their hair. And he wanted to do it in a way that was in line with the sensibilities of women at the time.
The Rebbe was so acutely aware of those like American sensibilities and how they still could be integrated into what on the 1840 podcast we call traditional sensitivities, but I think in the Rebbe would call it almost like mystical ideas, and integrating that mysticism into the sensibilities.
Yeah, because the wig becomes an object of a mitzvah. Like, it becomes elevated to something of kedusha, of holiness. And why not also have a beautiful wig? Just like you have a beautiful menorah, or like a beautiful set, like, beautify this mitzvah, and also you enjoy it more, and then you have more of a desire to do it. So for sure, over the years, I met many women who absolutely hate wearing a sheitel, no matter how beautiful it is. It's uncomfortable. It's super expensive. The sheitel industry, not throwing shade on anyone, but it's a little bit manipulative. Like, people charge exorbitant amounts. So, but I think that, like you said, it ties back into this question of, the Rebbe's outlook and the material world. Like, the importance of aesthetics in the Rebbe's vision is that everything should be beautiful. And part of it is for outreach, obviously, I think, is to show secular Jews that Judaism is not something of the past. It is a living religion. It is a living connection to God. And the kind of aesthetics and the materiality and fashion and decor become an entryway into understanding that.
So you have been so generous with your time, and I really hope either you'll give us permission to share your dissertation, or hopefully we'll see it as a book. Before I get to our rapid fire questions, I think one thing, and this has been the theme of everything, but I want to ask it as its own distinct question. You have been exposed to so much more than your average Orthodox Jew, more than your average secular Jew, because you really emerge from the center of secular thought and of the academia, and the center of like gender studies, where all the culture wars were coming. And then you moved, again, you kind of did the interviews with each sect, and then you moved and you did this dissertation, which you're really interacting with the full spectrum of the female experience in Chabad, in Judaism, and in the world. Meaning you didn't only speak and only quote people who had a wonderful experience and no doubt and no issues. How do you avoid the nagging doubt that when you are exposed to so many different ways of life, how do I know that I really got it right? Most of the world, most of the Jewish world, most of the Orthodox world is not Chabad. And yet, there is this very unique approach. But even for me, like, how do you avoid the whispers of all of the past experiences, philosophies, culture, who would roll their eyes with cynicism and say, oh, Chava was this promising, emerging Jew, and I don't know when it happened, I don't know who to blame, but she is brainwashed.
Okay, well, I was going to say, I bought it hook, line, and sinker, that Chabad Hasidus is like it is, for me, I'll say it, I really, really deeply believe that in Yiddishkeit we have 70 faces of the Torah, right? And I remember being in seminary, and I went to Sfat, I started becoming Chabad, and I was like, I feel like my Yiddishkeit is becoming alive. Like, this is what I was looking for. And I had a very, very close friend, very deep spiritual person who was also like floating around trying to find her place. And I was like, you got to come to Chabad with me. Like, you got to be Lubavitcher. This is it. And she was like, I don't know. It doesn't speak to me. Like, I don't know. I'm just not, it's not the right thing for me. And she became like Hardal in Israel, like a kind of mix of like Dati Leumi, Haredi. And I remember for a few years, I was like upset, I was like, come on, she's like missing out on this. I'm answering your question through the opposite. Like, but I've definitely come to realize that, everyone has a community that speaks to them, and that is their pathway to reach Hashem. And I totally accept that. On the other hand, I think Chabad Hasidus, for me, it touches on all aspects of a person: emotional, mental, physical, practical, social, professional. Everything's found for me within the Rebbe's teachings. And I see the ways that it has slowly seeped out and affected the Orthodox world as a whole. And I think And I think you see so many people that are not Lubavitchers, but they respect the Rebbe, they're connected to the Rebbe, and, we're here on 30 years after Gimel Tammuz, and the Rebbe's influence is just exponential because of all the people he's touched, and they may be talking about ideas from the Rebbe, and they don't even know that they're from the Rebbe because they're 3 steps removed, Mm-hmm. And so I'm not big on like the boxes, like you have to be a Lubavitcher, you have to beard or not, or this or that, or shape or whatever. Like I found my home in Judaism, and other people have a different home in Judaism, but I do deeply believe in the Rebbe's teachings and that they're universal.
It is really, really incredible. Before I apologize. I know I'm taking advantage of your time, and you have a young child who someone is babysitting for, but that's exactly what I wanted to ask about. I want to come back to the personal, and that is, I just need to ask, how did your parents deal
Everyone
with
asks this question. Okay, so I'll give you the short answer. The long answer is, many phases, but the short answer is that my parents saw that from a young age, I was a very idealistic person and very stubborn. And so when I became like a radical feminist in college, they were like, oh boy, like, okay, we kind of saw this coming. You found like your thing that you're obsessed with. And then after a year of that, I quickly switched and became an Orthodox Jew. And they're like, oh boy, here's the next thing, But then that has lasted for about 15 years. So over the years, they're like, okay, not so much a phase, And I think what's been really important is that I was very intense for many years. Very, very ideological. Black and white, this is right, this is wrong. And I think over the years as a Baal Tshuva, especially going through my PhD and kind of bringing something that was very important from my past into my present and integrating it into my Judaism, that was a process that I think kind of brought my parents around to see the ways that I'm still the same person. And I am also achieving kind of these goals that I have, and Judaism has not, God forbid, prevented me from achieving them, but in fact, like created even broader way for me to achieve those goals. And at the same time, having a PhD, having 3 kids. So I think my parents are, thank God, are very proud of me.
Really incredible. And it really is an incredible PhD. Again, the title is The Hasidic Face of Feminism, Gender Between Modernity and Mysticism in Chabad Lubavitch. Are there plans to make it into a book?
Yes, God willing. Actually, one of the things I have a question for your listeners is if I should make it an academic book that would be used in universities and classes, or I'm very on the fence if I should make it a popular book and just have a wider audience.
I feel very strongly, and we don't know each other, but I am a very big believer that the answer must be both. I have published, not super academic, I have a more serious academic chapter coming out with some Brill book that'll cost $400, and it's a chapter on sin in world religions and some fancy academic book they're putting out. But most of what I do is substantive pop. I know you're asking our listeners, and I'm answering, but I believe in the building that bridge between popular and academic is actually part of. It's almost on a microcosm, like building that dira b'tachtonim for these elevated ideas, but bringing them down to the common popular masses, I think, is part of the mission of Hasidus, part of the mission of Kishiafutsu Mainasecha Chutza, is not to have your ideas just in the academy, though I think the academy pushes us to articulate things very precisely, and I'm grateful to the academy for that. But chutza means everybody, and taking the loftiest ideas, even with the fanciest titles, and bring them to as many people as possible. I cannot thank you enough, Chava, and I wanted to conclude with my more rapid fire questions. I'm so grateful to you. My first question, not specifically women, but specifically on the issue of women and Chabad. You mentioned 2 of the Rebbe's talks that we will hopefully link to. What introductory sources or what introductory textbooks would you offer to men and women who want to explore the themes that you have discussed more, aside from, God willing, your own forthcoming books and present dissertation?
Oh, good question. This is hard. I think that this is what's kind of missing, like a general overview and also something updated. You have an academic book called Mystics, Mavericks, and Merrymakers by Stephanie Levin. And that's a fascinating look inside women's lives in Crown Heights, young girls. And I think she presents a pretty fair spectrum of women's experiences. You have Elliot Wolfson's book, which is very opaque, very hard to read, but I think he touches on a lot of core concepts.
Oh, yeah. Elliot Wolfson's book, which I've been talking about in all of my interviews on Chabad, turned my Judaism upside down, inside out. You kind of have to roll it up and smoke it. You can't really read the book.
You just got to intuit what he means, because it's not clear. But there is a very clear book called Social Vision. And
Ellie Rubin, my favorite, and he's the one who connected us.
Oh, yes, exactly. So we should thank him publicly, because that was great.
Yeah.
I mean, I think with gender, you have a lot of insider Chabad books that I feel like need to be updated. They're like from the 80s, the 90s, and I'm hoping to come out with some more updated things. But the Rebbe's talks, especially ones that are accessible, translated into English, go on Chabad.org. You know, that for me is like, you would type in Jewish women on Chabad.org. I actually have a number of articles if people are interested in reading more of my writing. I have a lot of articles on the jewishwoman.org.
Wow. My next question, if somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to take another sabbatical with no responsibilities whatsoever to go back and get a second PhD, I know, which is the most horrifying question. I also did a dissertation. No one wants a second.
I'm just kidding.
But if there was another topic that could merit your full attention and exploration, what would that topic of that dissertation be? Okay,
so we touched on a number of issues over our conversation that I want to go back to the idea of what is something that is important in a woman's life that is not considered of value or of importance academically. And for me, this whole idea of shaitels, of the wigs, now they're being produced in China, and you have this kind of global supply chain like happening where you have these Chinese women making wigs for Jewish women, and you have a lot of issues of aesthetics, of market value, all these things changing. It's tied in with a lot of shifts in the world. So I would want to do like a deep study of the relationship between the Chinese women that make wigs with the Jewish women that wear them, and how you have the shaitel who are the middle people, and kind of the religious undertones of all of these aspects, the commercial, religious, and personal undertones. And then obviously kind of these bigger picture questions of how does a woman's role tie into the material world?
That is a super brilliant. I hope you get to do it. My final question, I'm always curious about people's sleep schedules, especially young mothers. What time do you go to sleep at night, and what time do you wake up in the morning?
My nighttime cutoff is 10:30. Ideally, like 8:45, I'm in pajamas and like getting ready for bed. And then we just moved recently, so my kids have been up at 5:30 every morning. But for your listeners, there is a magic alarm clock. It's a sheep that eyes open when the kids are allowed to leave their room. So now I get to sleep till 6:30.
Chava Green, I am so grateful for you joining, sharing your wisdom, your scholarship, your experience. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I was so fascinated by this conversation and how it highlighted, once again, the integration of phenomenology and philosophy, which I think stands at the heart of how Chabad and the Rebbe in particular approached Hasidic thought, Jewish thought, and Jewish life, of wedding together even the lowest form and experience of a child, of just a regular man or woman on the street, and to ensure that their experiences were informed by even the most transcendent mystical ideology, even if those very people who are participating in the experience don't necessarily have the capacity or the educational background to fully comprehend the mysticism on which their experiences are grounded. And I think this is something that the Rebbe was doing in general for American Jewry. The Rebbe in many ways was translating the world of Hasidus, the vision of the Baal Shem Tov, the vision of Chabad and the Baal Tanya, and all of the Rebbe through the generations, and he was translating their conceptual philosophy to an American phenomenology, to an American experience, and learning how to wed the two, that America is no different. And even here we can have transcendent Hasidic and mystical experiences. And I think one of the most beautiful ways where you see this, and it relates specifically to gender, is actually how careful and how much the Rebbe was involved in the publication of Chabad's children's magazine, which is actually fittingly called Mashiach Times. And there's a wonderful article, and there's a thread on social media by my dearest friend. He's really a wonderful person. I got to see him recently. His name is Rabbi Mordechai Lightstone, a.k.a. you may know him as Muttel, and he's kind of the Chabad shliach to the internet. Everything that he does, so much of what he does is focused on the online culture and technology and all the stuff. And he wrote this amazing article as well as a thread that talks about the role of Al Jaffe, who you may not know who that is. I believe he was 102 when he passed. But Al Jaffe was the artist behind Mad Magazine, Olav Hashalom. I don't think they publish it anymore, of blessed memory. Mad Magazine, which if you remember, always had this goofy child on the cover. His name was Alfred E. Newman. And Al Jaffe was the one who pioneered, I think, the Spy vs. Spy. He pioneered in the back of Mad Magazine, you would be able to fold the two pages together and create a third image. I'm sorry for our listeners who have no idea what I'm talking about. That saddens me that we have a generation who does not know what Mad Magazine is. But it was a major magazine. I mean, all the kids used to read this. It was a little gross. It was very often inappropriate, but we all read it. And the artist behind it was somebody named Al Jaffe. And Al Jaffe was the artist who then went on to be the primary illustrator for Chabad children's magazine known as Mashiach Times. He even developed this column. Instead of Spy vs. Spy, he had this thing called the Spy, like with a little bit of a Yiddish pronunciation, who had the Spy mobile. It was really, really wonderful. But one thing that I found so fascinating was how involved the Rebbe was and what his notes were for the magazine. And one thing that the Rebbe wanted to make sure of is that every cover of this children's magazine had a girl and a boy on the cover. And the Rebbe actually wrote a personal note at one point to one of the cover illustrators and said, this cover just has a boy. We have to make sure that they both are included. In a different note to editors, the Rebbe once wrote, and it's just fascinating how involved he was, the illustrations of a children's magazine. He wrote, it's not fitting that people should be drawn with unnaturally oversized bodies and cartoonishly large noses, even though that style is common. It's a huge educational mistake. The Rebbe didn't want children to laugh at how other people looked. That is not the right way to educate children. And my takeaway from all this, as fascinating as the story of Al Jaffe is, and you definitely should go online and read the story, it's called How Cartoonist Al Jaffe Found His Inner Jewish Superhero. And this was written in his lifetime when he was still 99 years old. I believe he passed away 3 years later. I'm bringing this up not so I could wax nostalgic about Mad Magazine and the artwork of Al Jaffe, though I certainly am. I'm bringing this up to show that the mystical outlook of the Rebbe was always laser focused on wedding and integrating mystical philosophy and ideology with phenomenology, with the experience. And you can't have a mystical philosophy that just addresses those who understand mysticism that's very deep. It has to lead and be able to translate into an actual lived experience, where even a children's magazine has to cohere and align with a certain outlook. And I think in many ways that's something very instructive for the Jewish community at large, and even specifically for the non-Chabad Orthodox community. Do we have a specific ideology that can clearly translate to the lived experience of growing up in the Orthodox community? And I think this question is most important when we think about children. I think it's extraordinarily important when we think about the experience of women growing up in the Jewish community, and any part of the population which isn't seen, and I'm using air quotes, as kind of the central population of the, B'nai HaYeshiva, or people who are spending their time day and night in the most traditional sense studying. We have to understand that we need an ideology that can encompass our entire community and ensure that that ideology is integrated and informed in that lived experience. Because I think the greatest expression of mysticism is not the mysticism that is told supernally and transcendently at gatherings with great scholars who understand all of the terminology and the language in the world. But the greatest expression of mysticism is that vision of the Rebbe of creating a dira b'tachtonim, a lived experience in this world, no matter the population, no matter the background, no matter the educational prowess or acumen, but a lived experience, a dira b'tachtonim, a dwelling place for divinity in the very ordinariness of our lives. That, in fact, is the greatest expression of mystical thought, a mysticism that can include, guide, and encompass the entirety of the Jewish people, and through the Jewish people, the world. That is the vision of the Rebbe. That is everything that Chava Green talks about in her dissertation. That is everything that every note that the Rebbe sent to Al Jaffe, the old artist from Mad Magazine, and his guidance for the Mashiach times, was an act of translation and taking mysticism and the most transcendent ideas and translating them for this generation in America in their own personal lives. So thank you so much for listening. This episode was actually episode not by our friend Dina Emerson, who's away for the summer, but our dearest friend Rob. Thank you, Rob. If you enjoyed this episode or any of our episodes, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play on a future episode. That number, of course, is 516-519-3308. Or, of course, you can email us at info@1840.org. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18, followed by the word 40, FORTY.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.
Show